Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is a J-Man Time, and today I have a video on one of the most forgotten Czech tanks used in the Second World War and during the interwar years. This tank here is one, if not the first, true Czech light tank and predated both the Panzer 38 and Panzer 35T series of tanks that were later used during the early half of World War II. And that tank is the Czech LT VZ-34, or the light tank model 1934. And this was a limited production Czech light tank that was the basis for both the Panzer 35 and Panzer 38T series of light tanks that would later go on to serve in the German army and in various other Axis armies during the Second World War. The Panzer 34T, as it's sometimes called, or the LT-34, was a limited production tank developed between 1932 and 1934, based off of dozens of experimental tanks that were developed by Czechoslovakia between the 1920s and early 1930s. This tank in particular was based on the Škoda Mu-6, or the Škoda Mu-6, which was an enlarged tankette that was developed between 1931 and 1932. This vehicle here, the LT-34, was the successor of that enlarged tankette and was Czechoslovakia's first produced tank, or mass-produced tank, of the early to mid-1930s, and would go on to serve as the basis for most of the Czech light tanks and even some Czech experimental medium tanks. The vehicle had a weight of 7.5 tons, and the main armament was one 37.2mm Škoda UV model 1934 37mm tank gun, which had an armor penetration of about 22 to 45mm at a range of 500 to 1,500 yards. The vehicle's armor thickness was 8 to 15mm, and the vehicle had a speed of 30 km per hour or 19 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 3. Now, only 51 tanks were produced plus the prototype, and they were used from 1934 until 1944 by both the Czechoslovak Army, the German occupation forces in Czechoslovakia, and also by the Kingdom of Hungary, the Slovak Republic, and the forgotten state of Carpatho-Ukraine during the interwar years, before World War II. These tanks served in the Czech Army from 1934 until the Czech region of Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland were annexed in 1939, in March 1939, that is. This was known as the Sudetenland Crisis. During that time period, Germany requested that Czechoslovakia hand over the German-speaking Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Later on, the Czechs would give in to Germany's demand, but Hitler would literally take all of the Czech lands in March 1939. This is literally an example of you give someone an inch and they take a mile, as in Germany took literally all of the Czech regions. As a result, Slovakia became its own independent state, and there was also a second independent state known as the state of Carpatho-Ukraine, which was a state run by a mixture of Slovak, Ukrainians, and Czechs that did not want to live under the German occupation or as part of the newly formed Slovak state. During that time period, the 51 Panzer 34Ts were divided between the various factions. Germany captured 22 LT-34 tanks from the Czech army and the Czech regions that were now under German control, and these tanks were not adopted by the German forces and were only used as experimental vehicles and training vehicles by the German occupation forces from 1939 until 1944. In 1943, the Waffen-SS requested that the remaining 10 tanks be sent to Croatia and to be used as anti-insurgent vehicles by both the Croatian army and the Waffen-SS against the Yugoslav partisan forces that were advancing on Croatia in 1943-1944. Ultimately, only 2 of the remaining 10 tanks were given to the Waffen-SS. The remaining tanks were either scrapped or were used for spare parts, and only their turrets remained to be used as fortifications both in Germany and in occupied Europe. The remaining 2 tanks would serve in the Waffen-SS units deployed in Croatia until they were either destroyed or captured by Yugoslav forces between 1943 and 1945. Slovakia held on to 27 LT-34 tanks, and these tanks were evacuated from the Czech regions during the German annexation in 1939, and they, along with dozens of Panzer 35 and Panzer 38Ts, formed the basis of the Slovak armored divisions. In September 1939, Slovakia would join the Axis powers and would invade Poland, along with Germany, the Soviet Union, and Lithuania, and the Free City of Danzig during the Polish campaign of September 1939, and these LT-34 tanks were used along with other Czech vehicles to engage Polish tank units during the Slovak invasion. Slovakia would annex at least 2 small regions of Poland into its own Slovak state. Later on, in 1941, Slovakia would join the Axis powers again during the invasion of the Soviet Union, also known as Operation Barbarossa, and between 1941 and at least 1942-1943, the Slovak LT-34 tanks were used against the Soviet light tanks like the Soviet T-26 and Soviet BT-5 and 7. After 1943, these tanks were later used in 1944 during the Slovak National Uprising. Between August and September 1944, there was a major uprising in Slovakia, and this was against the National Socialists both in Slovakia and the German army units that were also stationed in Slovakia. The Slovak insurgents had about 10 of these LT-34 light tanks in their service. The Slovak insurgent army numbered between 18 and 78,000 fighters in total, and they had captured tons of other vehicles, including some German tanks and armored cars. Ultimately, the Slovak uprising was largely crushed by the end of September 1944, but there were still insurgent groups operating all the way up until the liberation of Slovakia in 1945 by both American and Soviet forces, along with some units of the Czech and Slovak liberation forces, and insurgent units. 10 of these vehicles served in the Slovak national uprising all the way until the end of World War II. Now, another country that used the LT-34 is the forgotten state of Carpatho-Ukraine. In December 1938, the region of Carpatho-Ukraine became the first country to secede from Czechoslovakia. In December of 1938, the Carpatho-Ukraine became its own independent state, but wasn't recognized by anyone in Europe but themselves in Czechoslovakia. Later on, in March 1939, Germany would annex the Czech regions of Czechoslovakia, and Slovakia would become its own state also. So there were 2 states, the Carpatho-Ukraine and the state of Slovakia. The Carpatho-Ukraine had at least 5 of the LT-34 light tanks, along with a few other Czech tanks and armored cars that formed the basis of the Carpatho-Ukraine army. The Carpatho-Ukraine army numbered just 4,700 men. Now, Carpatho-Ukraine was made up of ethnic Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Czechs that did not want to live under German occupation or be a part of the newly formed state of Slovakia. And they remained independent for only about 3.5 months. In late March 1939, Hungary invaded Carpatho-Ukraine and Slovakia at the same time, and these were 2 separate conflicts that were technically connected. These were the Carpatho-Ukraine War of March 1939, and there was also the Slovak-Hungarian War. This was the war between Hungary and Slovakia, and there was also the war between Carpatho-Ukraine and Hungary. During the invasion, at least 1 of the Carpatho-Ukraine LT-34s were captured by the Hungarian army, while the remaining tanks managed to flee to Slovakia. During the Slovak-Hungarian War, the Hungarians managed to capture a small portion of Slovak land, although the remaining territories that they had invaded in Slovakia were recaptured by the Slovak army. So only a tiny portion of Slovakia and the entire state of Carpatho-Ukraine were lost during these two conflicts that happened relatively at the same time. The one tank that was captured, the one LT-34 tank captured by the Hungarian forces, was used from March 1939 until 1943 as both a frontline tank and also as a training vehicle for the Hungarian army, becoming one of the few Czechoslovakian vehicles to serve in the army, with the exception of the Panzer 35 and Panzer 38Ts that were later given to Hungary by Germany in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. So that one LT-34 became the rarest tank in the Hungarian army from 1939 until 1943. And there you have it. This was pretty much the basic history of the most forgotten Czech tank of World War II, the LT-34, or the Linky tank number 34, or model 34. The rarest Czech tank, one of the rarest Czech tanks developed during the interwar years, and one of the rarest Czech tanks to serve in the Second World War. But what do you all think of the Czech LT-34 light tank? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was a J-Man Time, signing off.